Ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous honour to be following Professor Dershowitz onto the stage, and it's also incredibly refreshing for me to have met a short while ago a distinguished lawyer, because normally when I meet a lawyer I reach for my credit card immediately. This time I didn't have to. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak to you today about a pernicious and increasingly dangerous global conspiracy. On the 14th of May, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel to be an independent state under the terms of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181. Within hours, the armed forces of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen fell upon the fledgling nation of Israel, a despised Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world. Israel's very existence was considered an affront to the Islamic peoples. This was, of course, just the first in a series of invasions of Israel by massed Arab armies. But now, in 2011, Israel has the most powerful army in the Middle East. Even the most self-deceiving enemy cannot realistically believe that the country's destruction could be achieved by conventional military force. But many of Israel's enemies have still not given up the desire or the intention to annihilate her. Recognizing the emergence of a changed balance of power, they have gradually evolved three new tactics. The first, by Iran, is the pursuit of nuclear weapons, capable, in the words of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of wiping Israel off the map. The second is asymmetric conflict, guerrilla tactics, suicide bombings, missile attacks, hit-and-run operations, fought from behind the shield of innocent civilians, spreading terror throughout Israel's population, undermining her security, and seeking to lure her defense forces into actions that can be turned against her in the court of world opinion. Techniques that fit perfectly into the third new tactical ploy, a concerted conspiracy of propaganda against Israel's very existence. A campaign that has so far exceeded in its international scope anything dreamt of, even by the master propagandist, Dr. Joseph Goebbels himself. Delegitimization, spreading the idea that Israel is so evil that it has no right even to exist, aiming for the point where that idea becomes an acceptable, mainstream political argument in our own societies. If such a notion were to filter through to Western governments via the democratic process, then over time, the very survival of Israel as an independent nation would be at stake. It is no surprise, of course, no surprise that such a campaign has great popularity in the Arab and the wider Islamic world, any more than Goebbels' twisted propaganda machine succeeded in persuading so many Germans to his murderous cause. But what is truly shocking, ladies and gentlemen, is the traction that this propaganda has gained in the West. Among student bodies, teachers, university authorities, academics, think tanks, human rights organizations, aid agencies, parliamentary bodies, and perhaps most damaging of all, the mass media. A central aim in the conspiracy of delegitimization is to give validity and justification to attacks on Israel by groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, allowing them to strike at Israel with impunity, and encouraging the view that any retaliatory or defensive measures taken by Israel are by definition disproportionate and should be criminalized. I'm going to focus my remarks today on the military aspects of this conspiracy of delegitimization, which have been such a magnet for the anti-Israel lobby around the globe. Aspects which represent perhaps one of the greatest challenges for the nation of Israel, and which contain as well significant dangers for other Western democracies such as Britain and Norway that also have to fight jihadist terror. Norway, whose soldiers operate with such bravery, dedication, and professionalism in their provincial reconstruction team and their military and police mentoring teams in Afghanistan today. An armed force that I have had the pride and the privilege to work with in many countries around the world. And like every other country in Europe, Norway as well remains under continual threat of attack from jihadist terrorists here at home. When I spoke about how the delegitimization campaign against Israel had gained traction, I did not mention the institution that has done so much to further the cause of delegitimization in a way that has brought notoriety to what should be one of the world's most august bodies and most important champions of human rights, a body founded on the highest principles, whose work should be so necessary in the 21st century world, about whom we heard earlier from Professor Dershowitz, the United Nations Human Rights Council. A long catalogue of human rights horrors, many at a level of violence and on a scale so terrible as to sicken the heart of any decent human being, are perpetrated around the world. Iran executed hundreds who protested against the stolen elections in 2009. Torture in Iran is institutionalized and widespread. The Iranian authorities stone to death adulterers and hang homosexuals up from cranes. According to the Dalai Lama, 1.2 million Tibetans have been killed under Chinese rule. 500,000 men, women and children were slaughtered in Rwanda. Tens of thousands killed in Chechnya. Yet on all of these issues, the UN Human Rights Council has remained silent since its formation. The only country ever to have been specifically condemned by the Council is a multicultural democracy with equal rights for women, homosexuals, religious and ethnic minorities, which has a free press and an independent judiciary: Israel. And while condemning Israel repeatedly, the Human Rights Council has neglected the rights of 350 million citizens of the Middle East. I had the dubious honor to give evidence to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. It was actually at the behest of that great advancer and supporter and worker for human rights, Hillel Neuer, who I think you'll be fortunate enough to hear from later this afternoon. I was invited to speak at the council by Hillel Neuer, a council, by the way, that includes among its members Bahrain, China, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And of course, until just a few weeks ago, even after our television screens had been filled with reports of its government's murder by sniper fire and by helicopter gunship of more than 1,000 of its own people, even after that, Libya remained on the UN Human Rights Council. You can see why I consider an appearance before this council to be a very dubious honour indeed. I gave evidence to the council during its consideration of Judge Richard Goldstone's report on the 2009 Gaza conflict. Although not quite a lone voice, mine was certainly a very lonely voice. among the many dozens of speeches endorsing Goldstone and repudiating Israel that were made over the 2 days of that hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I said to the UN Human Rights Council. During its operation in Gaza, the Israeli Defense Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare. What was behind my comments? Ladies and gentlemen, the commanders of the Israeli Defense Forces who planned and implemented Operation Cast Lead, the code name given to the 2009 campaign in Gaza, had a very clear understanding, as do British, American, and Norwegian commanders fighting against the Taliban today in Afghanistan, of the absolute necessity to minimize civilian casualties. Apart from basic human decency and humanitarian considerations, they knew how vital to a counterinsurgency conflict is winning over the hearts and minds of the people, especially in a conflict where they could be sure that killing innocent civilians is exactly what the enemy would be trying to lure them to do. Because Hamas, as for Hezbollah in Lebanon, as for the Taliban in Afghanistan, and as for Al-Qaeda and the Shia militants in Iraq, used their own people as both tactical and strategic weapons of war. They used them on the tactical level as human shields, to hide behind, to stand between Israeli forces and their own brave fighters, sometimes forcing women and children to remain in the positions that they would use to launch attacks from, a tactic that we have seen grimly employed even in the last few days by the Libyan tyrant to protect himself and his murderous military forces from American, British, and French airstrikes. Hamas used their people too on the strategic level, luring IDF troops to attack and kill them, their own people. Deaths to be callously exploited in the media as a means of discrediting Israeli forces, exactly as happens almost every single day in Afghanistan, and as we shall no doubt see more in Libya. In these most difficult circumstances, the IDF commanders took unprecedented measures to minimize civilian casualties. The Israelis conducted an intelligence operation in the run-up to Cast Lead that was huge, complex, and fraught with mortal danger. They took grave risks with the lives of their human intelligence sources to pinpoint enemy positions, so their forces could deal as effectively as possible with the enemy fighters and their leaders, while minimizing harm to the civilian population. And be assured that had any of those human intelligence sources been captured, the penalty would have been terrible indeed, because just before the Gaza conflict, Hamas reintroduced the punishment of crucifixion for prisoners that they felt were aiding the enemy. When possible, the Israeli Defense Forces gave at least 4 hours' notice to civilians to leave areas designated for attack, an action that handed a distinct advantage to Hamas. Attack helicopter pilots had total discretion to abort a strike if there was too great a risk of civilian casualties in the area. During the conflict, the IDF allowed huge amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza and even unilaterally announced a daily 3-hour ceasefire, knowing this would give Hamas vital time and space to regroup, to re-equip, and to redeploy for future attacks. And that, of course, added to the immense danger already faced by their own Israeli troops. The Israelis dropped 1 million leaflets warning the population of impending attacks. They phoned tens of thousands of Palestinian households in Gaza, urging them in Arabic to leave homes where Hamas might have stashed weapons or be preparing to fight from. Similar messages were passed in Arabic on Israeli radio broadcasts. But despite Israel's extraordinary measures, a number of innocent civilians were killed and wounded. That was inevitable. Let us not forget, Hamas were deliberately trying to lure the Israelis to kill their own people. And despite the media obsession, it is rare that military forces can ever deliver truly surgical strikes in such circumstances. Every military commander knows that no matter how sophisticated your targeting, no matter how high-tech your equipment, no matter how careful your planning, the ever-present friction and chaos of military operations means there will always be mistakes in combat. And of course, in every army, there will always be bad soldiers who deliberately or through incompetence go against orders. But like Norwegian, British and American soldiers, Israel's forces operate under a strict moral code and are held accountable by the Israeli government. Even with so much that can go wrong, this was very far from the wholesale butchery of the civilian population that has been gleefully trumpeted by international human rights, aid groups and governments. In fact, the Hamas Interior Minister, Fatih Hamad, recently gave an interview in which he admitted for the first time that the majority of deaths inflicted by Israel during the campaign in Gaza were combatants and not civilians. This is contrary to Hamas's previous position, in which it is claimed that the majority of civilians, the majority of casualties, were innocent civilians. It is also contrary to the strident and repeated assertions of so many international groups who have parroted Hamas's original claims over and over again without a word of thought. The estimates of civilian versus combatant figures put forward now by Hamas are virtually the same as the estimates Israel made at the end of the war. Of the approximately 1,300 deaths in the Gaza conflict, Hamas now confirms that 700 were fighters. The rest, 600, were civilians. That means a ratio of under one civilian death for every combatant. Does that sound bad? Yes, of course it's bad. Of course the death or wounding in battle of every single innocent civilian is a dreadful and grave tragedy. But a study published by the United Nations shows that the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in Gaza was by far the lowest in any asymmetric conflict in the history of warfare. The UN estimate there's been an average 3-to-1 ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in this type of conflict worldwide. 3 civilians for every combatant killed. That is the estimated ratio in Afghanistan, 3-to-1. In Iraq and in Kosovo, it was worse. The ratio is believed to have been at least 4-to-1. Anecdotal evidence suggests the ratios are very much higher indeed in Chechnya and in Serbia. The extremely low ratio in Gaza, less than 1-to-1, flatly contradicts many of Goldstone's assertions and the bleating insistence of various other human rights groups about Israel's alleged crimes against humanity, and supports my assertion about the steps taken in that conflict by the Israeli Defense Forces to avoid civilian deaths. Like every army, including other Western armies, the IDF is of course far from perfect, but their work to reduce the risk of civilian casualties in Gaza went well beyond the requirements of the Geneva Convention, to an extent that would not even be contemplated for a single moment by most other armies around the world, least of all by the armies of many of the countries that have the most vocally condemned Israel at the United Nations. The campaigns fought by Israel in Lebanon and Gaza, and by the US and the UK in Iraq and in Afghanistan, have several common factors. But there is also a major difference. In many countries around the world, the start point is that Israel is always in the wrong. The US, the UK, Norway, other NATO countries, even when themselves causing the unintentional deaths of innocent civilians, attract no such automatic condemnation. As with Operation Cast Lead, the tragedy of the Gaza flotilla incident in May 2010 has been widely exploited as part of the conspiracy against Israel. There is every reason to believe that the activists on board the ship Mavi Marmara set out deliberately to provoke the Israeli boarding party into an attack that would cause bloodshed to be exploited in the world's media, which of course is exactly what happened. The Turkish humanitarian group, IHH, were prominent among the organisers of the flotilla, and they had purchased the Mavi Marmara for that purpose. As well as being a genuine humanitarian aid group, the IHH is also a radical Islamic organisation. They have provided extensive support to Hamas against the Palestinian Authority. The IHH is vehemently anti-Israel and anti-American. They have extensive connections with international jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda. According to a French investigative magistrate specializing in terrorism, the IHH played an important role in an Al-Qaeda plan to carry out a mass casualty attack at the Los Angeles International Airport on the eve of the millennium. So, not an entirely innocent humanitarian organization attacked without justification by vicious Israeli thugs as presented in the world media by governments and by the UN. The Israeli handling of the flotilla incident was far from a model military operation. Indeed, Israel's Turkle Commission criticized a lack of preparedness by the commandos who boarded the Mavi Marmara. But I have seen nothing to suggest that their actions amounted to a breach of international law. Many have stridently proclaimed that the Gaza blockade itself is illegal. But does not the government of Israel have the right and indeed the duty to protect its citizens against the rearming of Hamas and other jihadist groups in Gaza, which continue, even in recent days, to attack the civilian population of Israel with rockets and undoubtedly desire to expand their conflict in line with the proclaimed objective of destroying Israel as an entity? Was the boarding by the British Royal Navy of the 500-foot cargo ship Nisha in December 2001 criticised as being an illegal act? The Indian-owned Nisha, which was sailing for Mauritius and bound to London, was suspected, erroneously as it turned out, of having Al-Qaeda terrorist materials on board and was intercepted in international waters. During the Provisional IRA terror campaign in the 1970s and 1980s, the Royal Navy, the Irish Navy, the French Navy often boarded ships heading towards Ireland and searched them for munitions at a time when Gaddafi's Libya was arming the IRA with weapons, missiles and explosives that killed hundreds of British soldiers and civilians. But unlike Israel's blockade, which has an identical purpose, these boardings were never criticised or characterised illegal, and still are not. And I'll bet that no one today will accuse NATO of acting illegally in the naval blockade it has just put in place against Libya. Again, an operation with an identical purpose, a blockade in which, with supreme irony, Turkey is playing a role. I wonder what treatment Turkish boarding parties would give to IHH-like extremists that tried to ambush them. I have witnessed Turkish military restraint firsthand, and I can imagine it. But then none of these actions are carried out by Israel, to whom a completely different standard is unfairly and unrealistically applied by so many. even in the Western world, as a result of the international conspiracy against Israel. That is why they are not criticized. That conspiracy of delegitimization against Israel is both deepening and widening. And on top of this, of course, there is the extraordinary turbulence throughout the Middle East today. Nobody can know what will happen in any of the countries in the region as a result of the ongoing revolutions. But there is a very real possibility that Egypt could in due course have a government dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, a radical group sharing the imperial ambitions of al-Qaeda, if not al-Qaeda's methods, a group whose spiritual father, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who triumphantly returned to his home country of Egypt after years in exile, once said, "The last punishment of the Jews was carried out by Hitler. By means of all the things he did to them, even though they exaggerated this issue, he managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hands of the believers." The Muslim Brotherhood are making different noises today at a time when they may think they can't afford to attract the condemnation of the West. But it is, of course, an instrument of the Muslim Brotherhood's policy to tear up the Egyptian peace treaty with Israel and to reopen the border with Gaza. One of the main reasons that Israel felt able to withdraw again from Gaza after the 2009 conflict was Egypt's assurances about sealing its border to prevent Hamas restocking with arms and munitions of war. Will Israel have any choice about entering Gaza in force again, or worse, if a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated Egyptian government allows Hamas full reign, or even directly supports their violent attacks against Israeli civilians? That is a very real prospect. And today we are seeing worrying increases to Hamas's campaign of rocket attacks against the civilian population of Israel. Yet even this is by no means the worst scenario that could emerge from the present instability in Egypt. I have not even touched on the increasing threats from Hezbollah in Lebanon and from Iran, whose fingerprints could well be all over yesterday's murderous bomb attack in Jerusalem. I've not spoken of the far-reaching implications of potential regime change in Jordan, the prospects for al-Qaeda expanding its already extremely dangerous presence in Libya and in Yemen, or a state in which the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a powerful and deadly al-Qaeda franchise, has free range. I'm sure many of us have plenty of criticisms of Israel, her policies, her politicians, and their actions, as we have of our own countries. But there is a huge difference between justifiable criticism and nakedly cynical delegitimization. If the IDF is forced to mount another operation in the Palestinian territories, as is likely, or to take active defensive steps elsewhere, the conspiracy will gain new energy as the vultures of the international community again circle, ever eager to feast on Israel's flesh. It will then become an even graver duty for every person who values the cause of freedom and democracy to recognize and to stand up against this dark conspiracy of delegitimizing the Israeli state and her brave, dedicated, humane, and democratically accountable armed forces. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.